So, good evening to our fifth class. It's the last one in this segment of the course. The next class, as I recall, is November the 1st. Friday, November the 1st. So, last class we've been looking at the Russian religious Renaissance, particularly some of the key ideas, some of which will come back in the papers, the case studies. So what we want to focus on here is not sort of going into the details of that, good evening, but more trying to get an overall sense of what the thinking is on religious philosophy, because it remains a fairly controversial and sensitive subject, strongly criticized in certain quarters of Orthodoxy, others more positively inclined, but as we see, some of the key ideas have not found general favor in subsequent Orthodox thought, but some of them carried into neo-patristic theology and have been elaborated on, further developed, and then sort of joined the kind of mainstream of modern Orthodox thinking. In terms of favorable assessments of Russian religious philosophy, perhaps the most favorable is that of Nicholas Zernov. Nicholas Zernov. Zernov was an Orthodox academic in the United Kingdom, very prominent also in the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. He held a major teaching post at Oxford, though it's the same chair, the chair of Eastern Christian Theology, that was subsequently held for a long time by Metropolitan Kallistos Ware. His major study is entitled The Russian Religious Renaissance of the 20th Century. It came out in 1963, and it's really from his book, from the title of this book, that the term the Russian religious Renaissance has stuck. It really wasn't referred to in that way before, but because it's such a good study, the expression has remained, despite the fact that it's been over half a century since it was published. It still remains the best historical study of Russian religious philosophy. Zernov himself was an important personality in the Orthodox theological scene in the first half of the 20th century, and he knew personally almost all of the major figures in exile. The advantage of the book and his approach to this period is that he really places Russian religious philosophy in the context of the social and political and intellectual ferment that characterized late imperial Russia. For Zernov, religious philosophy represented a return to the church. This is in the context of the intelligentsia in late imperial Russia, most of whom were atheists, many materialists, positivists, other Marxists of all sorts. So it's in this kind of context that he situates their importance. In terms of how he feels they have contributed to the development of Christian and more specifically Orthodox thinking in modern times, he lists a number of reasons. this is on pages 329 and 330 of his book. He writes, in summarizing the significance of the Russian religious renaissance of the 20th century, it can be said that, I'll list a number of things. First, it produced a convincing exposition of traditional orthodoxy, formulated in terms intelligible to modern educated people. So this is one of the things that came up earlier in a discussion. It was really sort of a high cultural, intellectual kind of milieu. I think some people would probably challenge his use of the word traditional orthodoxy because a lot of the ideas, as we have seen, were not all that traditional. In fact, some of them were quite innovative and, in the eyes of many, not really within the Orthodox tradition, even though they're in sort of a broad Christian context. Second, it preserved the continuity of Russian Christian culture at a time when it was being systematically destroyed by the communists. Of course, this applies more to the period after 1920, 1922, when most of the then leaders of the religious renaissance, those that were still alive, because some of them had already gone from the scene in the 19th century. So it applies mostly to the exile period, particularly based in Paris. Third, it enriched the ecumenical movement at an important period of its initial development by familiarizing it with Eastern theology. This is something that I will go into more in the course on ecclesiology and ecumenism in the spring. Though again, this is something that really took place primarily in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. He doesn't really deal with the sort of specific theological areas in which the religious renaissance made lasting contributions. There's another study. This one is by an Anglican scholar called Paul Valliere. He's an American, more an Episcopalian, and his book is entitled Modern Russian Theology. It sounds ambitious, but in fact it deals really with primarily with three personalities that we've seen. Alexander Bukharev in the 19th century, Vladimir Soloviev at the end of the 19th century, really the sort of leading philosopher of the Russian religious Renaissance, and Sergius Bulgakov. So it's really a study of these three, a very profound study of their thinking, but sort of using these three as a kind of a lead-in to the whole period. So he has a slightly different list from the list that we saw in terms of the main ideas, but what he considers to be the sort of contributions to modern Orthodox thought. Some of these we've seen before. One of them is the notion of what he calls the humanity of God, or what is referred to, translation that I prefer, God-manhood. So what we saw in terms of the implications, the full implications of the incarnation, in effect, in terms of God coming and taking on human nature, but the implications then for the return of humanity to God in the form of theosis. The concept of the whole of things, this I usually referred to earlier as all unity, a very integral view of all of creation, and we went into some of the aspects of this in terms of the attempt to find a principle that unifies creation and creator and the different types of knowledge. A greatly expanded doctrine of kenosis, the divine abasement. Again, I mentioned this is a key theme not only in Russian theology but also in Russian spirituality. Christ taking on the form of a servant, and hence related particularly to the poor and the suffering in society. He lists sophiology as one of the contributions, probably, as I said earlier, the most well-known and the most controversial aspect of Russian religious philosophy. So that will be the subject of one of our case studies in more detail, and we'll see where that fits into the whole scene of how God relates to creation. The relational logic of church and world dogmatics. I would link that with the sophiology, in effect, how God relates to the world. But there are sort of other aspects of that that I think we may touch on it when we come to that particular study. And notions of the church. Now, he defines this as a dogmatic case for a humane church. It's kind of a strange distinction, but it's really the extension of the Slavophile notion of sobernost, of how the church is not an institution, it's not the hierarchy, it's not the clergy, but it is all of the people of God, and all have a role in the church. In this list there are a couple of ideas, one in particular, which are very important in Russian religious philosophy. One of these is personalism. It's the theology of the human person. It sort of runs throughout all of the major thinkers of Russian religious philosophy, and it's one of the ideas that has found its way into neo-patristic theology in a very powerful fashion, and is probably one of the major contributions of Orthodox thinking to modern Christian theology as a whole. The other ideas related to this have to do in the sphere of ecclesiology, the theology of the church. There's another notion, even though some of the language is a little bit particular to the Russians, the idea of what is sometimes referred to or translated as the churching of life, or the Christification of life. I think I put this word up the last time, Tsarkovnost. So the basic idea here is that a commitment to Christ, to the church, is a total commitment of all aspects of life. Again, it's very much related to the concern of the religious philosophers that Christianity should permeate all sectors and aspects of society. So that's kind of on the positive side. On the negative side, there are some major critiques of Russian religious philosophy, and we'll look at two in particular, for which we have some readings in the reader. Probably the most consistent and severe critic of Russian religious philosophy has been Father George Florovsky. Although often he didn't criticize Russian religious philosophy directly, he often did it indirectly, with one major exception, and that major exception is Pavel Florensky. even though Sergius Bulgakov was far more important as a leader, in fact as the last great representative of Russian religious philosophy, because of Florovsky's own personal situation and relationship with Bulgakov, he studiously avoided criticizing him directly. In fact, Bulgakov, because they were both teaching from 1925 until 1939, they were both teaching at the St. Sergius Institute. So Bulgakov, in a sense, was Florovsky's boss. He was the dean. But theologically, they were sort of poles apart. But despite their theological differences, on the whole, they maintained very close personal relationships, which is really quite astounding. And I think it shows something that they reflected in their personal lives and attitudes towards each other, in both of them, the kind of personal respect to the other, despite their theological differences. I did an article on this some years back, sort of pointing out at different stages in their contacts over the years, including during World War II and up to the end of Bulgakov's life, and he died in 1944, how they sort of maintained this kind of respect for each other. The article's in French. There's no exact English equivalent to the article. So let's have a look at the text we have here from Florovsky. This is on page 138. So it's an extract from his monumental study, The Ways of Russian Theology, published in 1937. Even though the book was published in 1937, Florovsky set a kind of a chronological limit to what he would talk about with World War I. And I think this may have been due partly to his relationship with Bulgakov. Bulgakov's major theological publications date from the late 1920s, the 1930s, and then a few published posthumously after his death in 1944 and after World War II. So Florovsky doesn't actually talk about these major publications. He talks about Bulgakov's publications prior to the exile period. So, just to look at sort of some of these publications, some of the criticisms, we'll skip over the first couple of pages. One of the sort of general critique that emerges from this, and Florovsky is very consistent about this, is the critique of the importation of ideas from German philosophy, particularly what is the school of philosophy known as idealism, into orthodoxy, and through the Russian religious philosophers from Soloviev and Florensky and Bulgakov. Technically, he's right. A lot of the ideas and inspiration came from this particular school of German philosophy. But particularly in Florensky and Bulgakov, they attempted to infuse these ideas with a more Christian connection, more Christian notion, and particularly specifically a patristic one. Now, the extent to which they succeed is another question. If we look at page 139 on the right-hand side, there's a paragraph there which talks about Berchayev, in a reasonably positive fashion. Again, sort of being aware of his milieu, Berdyaev was in his environment in Paris at the time. So I think he's relatively mild with respect to Berdyaev. Incidentally, Berdyaev wrote an extremely critical review of this book. I don't remember whether it's in here or not. Yes, it is. Item 22 in the reader, under the title Orthodoxia and Humaneness, is, so it's in the section under neo-patristic theology, although Berdyaev is hardly in neo-patristic theology, but because it's such a strong critique of Florovsky's The Ways of Russian Theology, many of the points that Berdyaev criticizes the book for are in fact the critiques that later emerged of neo-patristic theology. It's very complicated, but when we come to that, when we come to neo-patristic theology,
Sorry, repeat that again? The critiques?
Well, Berdyaev's critiques that he advances. Now, he's writing about the book in 1937, shortly after it came out. He raises a whole series of critiques of the book and, in fact, of Florovsky's neo-patristic project. You have to go through the text very carefully because it's very emotional. Berdyaev, that was sort of one of his characteristics. Even though he was a philosopher, he could get very carried away with himself, and including in his writings, and including in this piece. So you have to sort of cast aside all of the emotional stuff and sort of look at the core of his critiques. But those particular points on which he's critical in later decades, particularly towards the end of the 20th century, the points that he criticizes in Florovsky's book are, in fact, some of the main critiques that emerged later, much later, of neo-patristic theology. So he was kind of right on the mark, right at the beginning of the whole movement of neo-patristic theology. But you have to sort of see it in retrospect, how accurate his intuitions were of some of the major failings, as we will see in the next two classes, of neo-patristic theology. No, sorry, that wasn't clear at the beginning, but...
No, I just did, I thought I caught something.
Yeah, the thinking there's a little bit convoluted, and I'm kind of thinking two stages ahead all the time. So let's look at some of the specific critiques here, which you have to sort of read through the lines a little bit, read between the lines. On page 140, on the left-hand side, S.N. Bulgakov. So this is Sergius Bulgakov. He talks about history. And it's kind of a funny critique in a way. You have to sort of understand that there are kind of two approaches to history. This is getting into a philosophy of history area. And Florovsky's coming from one direction, and he's criticizing Bulgakov and others who have a kind of a different view of history. So he's criticizing for historicism. And this view of history that he's criticizing is that history is, in a sense, driven towards an objective of sorts. It's kind of a progression. There's a sense that it's possible to identify in history. The other approach, which is Florovsky's approach, is that history is driven by, in effect, fortuitous events. It's kind of a series of unforeseeable events and caused by personalities over time, and there's no sort of real force driving history towards some kind of objective. You see when he says in the second paragraph there, this historicism derives in part from Marxism. Marxism as a philosophy is very highly structured in terms of social and economic forces. And you see, he says, from which it retains a considerable aftertaste of fatalism and predestination. So that's the sort of critique that he's putting, that not only Bulgakov, but in fact a lot of the thinking in the Russian religious Renaissance is somehow tainted, affected by this kind of determinism, is probably the best way of phrasing it, that events are driven by a force, and this is the deterministic side, against which individuals cannot sort of struggle or cannot overcome. And this is kind of a very high level sort of intellectual critique, but it plays out in certain areas, some of which will come out in some of the case studies that touch on the thinking of the religious Renaissance. And he goes on to say that such a fatalism has long been a psychological habit for the Russian intelligentsia. Not only the Russian intelligentsia, it's sort of almost built into very deep-seated Russian culture. Fatalism is sort of an acceptance that fate, hence the word fatalism, is determined, and humans are subject to this fate. It's not a particularly Christian concept. Actually, it's a fairly pagan concept, because what it does is it appears to run counter and destroy free will. A bit of an ironic critique in some ways, especially in the face of somebody like Berdyaev, one of whose major themes, in fact, was freedom, as I mentioned last time. So that's sort of two general critiques. The third one, which we touched on a little bit the last time, is at the top of page 140. Berdyaev also noted the chief danger, quote, the weakness of the religious Renaissance lies in the absence of a broad social base. It developed within a cultural elite. And in a sense, this is one of the reasons why the religious Renaissance ultimately had very little impact on the future of Russia, in contrast with other intellectual movements and philosophies, which were much more geared towards mobilizing the masses and appealing to the masses, and particularly, of course, Marxism had much more appeal, particularly to the industrialized proletariat, to use Marxist language, in the big cities. I think it may be worth pausing here for a minute. I don't remember where, I think I gave out last time the text from Anna Malley, where she goes through Berdyaev's text, The Russian Spiritual Renaissance at the Beginning of the 20th Century, and the journal Put. So this is beginning on page 120. In a sense, this is a bit of a remarkable criticism, because it's a self-criticism. Berdyaev was in the pre-war period, at the end of the 19th century and up to World War I, and even the first years of the the Bolshevik period, he was one of the leaders of this particular group. And hence, in this text, he's sort of reflecting back on that period. And I think he touches a lot of really key points. So the one that Florovsky is picking up and using to his own credit to criticize the Russian religious Renaissance is this notion of the lack of a broad social base. So part of this comes up on page 120 on the left-hand side, about the halfway down the page. There was not a sufficiently strong religious will, transfigurative life, and there was not participation in the movement among the wider strata of the people. This was nevertheless a movement among the cultural elite, estranged not only from the processes occurring among the masses of people, but also from the processes occurring in the wider circles of the intelligentsia. So he's contrasting it there with sort of broad peasant and worker and lower class societies in the city, on the one hand, but also when he talks about the wider circles of the intelligentsia, this is the non-Christian intelligentsia. And the Christian intelligentsia, even though it was very brilliant, was marginal to that in terms of influence. Let me see now. One of the points that he makes here that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and this will come up in one of our case studies, at the bottom of page 120 on the right-hand side, the last sentence there. This simultaneous was a struggle for personness, for the fullness of creative life of the person, a struggle with suppressive sociality. The person as a free spirit was set in opposition to society and to its pretensions to define the whole of life of the person. He's putting his finger here on, I said, one of the key ideas of the Russian religious Renaissance, the importance of the human person. And this is very much in the context as a Christian response to impersonal philosophies which downgraded the value of the individual human existence. And this, of course, played itself out in the philosophy of the Russian Revolution in Marxism, where the individual person, to put the two terms together, becomes simply a pawn, on the one hand, of these historical forces determined by social and economic relations. So this is Florovsky's criticism of the historicism that he feels, even though it was particular Marxist, there's some residue of this in the Russian religious Renaissance, but of course the origin of it is really in Marxism. The individual is downplayed there, but also in terms of the individual's utility in social terms is really determined by his willingness to go along with the philosophy, the dominant philosophy, which is Marxism, and the tendency within Marxism to sacrifice the individual for the supposed greater gain of society as a whole. The move towards an egalitarian society, in fact, means that the individual has to conform to that objective. If not, then the individual can be sacrificed. And that's the whole basis of the persecution of all opposition within the communist framework. I'm sure all of this sounds quite familiar to you, yes, from your background in one of the Soviet states. Let me see now. Where's there's anything else we want to pick up here. Perhaps the last thing that is the famous statement that Frosky quotes is on page 125 at the beginning of the second section. The weakness of the Russian spiritual renaissance was its absence of a broad social base that emerged among the cultural elite. The struggle for spiritual life and spiritual creativity led to a rift with the broad social movement and the mass of the people, and at the same time it was not in union with the traditional conservative popular religiosity. The isolation of the creators of spiritual culture at the beginning of the century increased all the more. The need for surmounting the isolation pushed some to the right. They hoped to merge themselves with those of old Russia, from which the intelligentsia were cut off, but no one was properly successful at this. There's a reflection here of the kind of framework that I mentioned when we started looking at the Russian religious renaissance between the three groups of theology, more in the previous paragraphs. For example, he talks about Khomyakov, and his language is always quite inflammatory. This is at the top of the left-hand column on page 125. Quantitatively, the reactionary church tendencies prevailed. This is the sort of official Russian Orthodox Church. But in any case, in the religious problematics of our thoughts at the beginning of the century, Khomyakov had no little significance. In other words, he was important, just as did Dostoevsky and Vladimir Soloviev, and from the thinkers of a later time, Rozanov and Fedorov. Official theology had no sort of significance. The upper church hierarchy played no sort of role. This is very much the point that I was making. Those who entered more deeply into church life turned themselves into the traditions of the Startsi, the elders, to the cult of Saint Seraphim, but not towards academic theology nor towards hierarchical authority. And further down the last couple of sentences, in the Russia of the 19th century, there was an abyss between the underground spiritual life being expressed in the Startsi and sanctity, in the search for New Jerusalem, the kingdom of God. So that's sort of one category. The sort of life of the church that carried on in the spirit of the spiritual renewal that took place in Russia, emanating primarily from the monasteries, influenced by the Philokalia, and which is referred to as the Philokalic revival, because of the importance of the Philokalia and hesychast spirituality. Free religious thought, which is really the Russian religious renaissance, and between the official church life, subordinate to the regime, deprived of the breath of the Spirit. So you have the sort of three categories there. So we were back. That was kind of a little bit of a sidetrack there to have a look at this text of Berdyaev's, which I said is partly a self-critique and partly a self-justification, because he does justify himself and the importance of this approach to the Russian religious thought at the time. There's one sentence in here which anybody who's interested in social and political thinking and modern orthodoxy, where he puts the question of the relationship between material welfare and spiritual welfare very directly. It's on page 128 at the top of the right-hand column. From the point of view of intellectual culture, this was a reactionary manifestation. We won't read the whole process. He's talking about the social question in Russia. On the other side, it must needs be said that the spiritual currents at the beginning of the 20th century insufficiently understood the religious significance of the social question. The problem of bread is not only a material but also a spiritual problem, a problem of the relationship of man towards man. Again, it's a sort of a critique of a non-religious approach to social and political questions. He's saying, again, coming from a Christian perspective, that looking at this strictly as a material problem of bread in the sense of how to provide for basic human needs in society as a whole can't be seen simply in a narrow context of feeding people or giving them the means of subsistence. It has to be seen in a spiritual context in terms of how people relate to each other in a religious context. So yeah, that's a sort of the foundation of a Christian political and social theology. Berdyaev is certainly one of the main figures in this, but even he relies a great deal on Vladimir Soloviev, who sort of set the pace for this in terms of developing a theology from a Christian perspective which underpins the concern of the state of society for the well-being of all of its citizens. It's really the underpinning of what we would refer to today as the welfare state, a Christian justification for that. And we can find that in Soloviev, long before this kind of thinking became dominant, even in Western societies. Okay, let's get back to Florovsky's critique. We were on around page 140. So we're on the right-hand side of page 140, the weak social base. So that's really the third critique in here. The fourth one is in the middle of that paragraph. The Russian religious renaissance, in quotation marks, strictly speaking, was only a return to the experience of German idealism and German mysticism. And he mentions a number of German thinkers. He's, in effect, trying to dismiss the importance of the Renaissance, the Russian religious Renaissance, by simply saying it was picking up ideas from outside, particularly German idealism and what he calls mysticism. In effect, more explicitly in other places, he and other critics refer to romanticism. Further down, he goes on, expands a little bit on this in the next paragraph. It is customary to speak of contemporary Russian philosophy as if it were a uniquely creative product of the Russian spirit. This is completely false, for on the contrary, the substitution of religious philosophy for theology characterized all Western Romanticism, especially the German variety. Now, why is he critiquing Romanticism as though it were something inherently wrong? Can somebody explain to me, in terms of cultural, social cultural context, what Romanticism is all about? Because it's a very important movement in Western thought, which eventually found its way into aspects of Russian thought and other Orthodox countries as well.
Just to care about each other? Just to care about each other, like in terms of...
No, you have to sort of, I don't know if anybody else can.
Was it more individualism?
That was one aspect of it, but in a sense it can almost be seen as a partial reaction against individualism, but individual in another sense. If you go back to the 18th century, because the what we refer to now as Romanticism is really a movement of the late 18th century and first half of the 19th century. And it's a movement which was not only sort of philosophical movement, it's very much a cultural movement in terms of poetry and music, even novels. And we refer to romantic music. It has nothing to do with personal romance. It's a school of music and culture of that period, which was a break from the previous cultural mode. The previous cultural mode had been largely determined by the Enlightenment.
Is it the move away from reason?
Yes, that's
more towards more of a intuitive, holistic, more of the intuitive, holistic understanding.
Yes, the Enlightenment was very much dominated by the emphasis on rationalism, human rationality as being the supreme human quality, and the notion that rationalism, whether it's applied in philosophy or in science, it's really the foundation of modern science, and ultimately found its way into the basis of industrialization and hence modernity. What is referred to as modernity, in effect, is the outcome of 18th century Enlightenment, that everything can be reduced to knowledge and intellectual knowledge and logic and reason. And you had a cultural context that reflected that, even in music. So the Romantic period, much more based on intuitive experience, in a sense more emotionally based, more personal based. This is where the individualism comes in that sense. But it's a different type of individualism than is found in the Enlightenment period. The Enlightenment period individualism was much more based on social and economic relations. This is where Marxism found its entry. The notion of what is mine, and keep your hands off it, kind of thing. So the Romanticism was a reaction against that, saying, well, human existence is more than just reason. There are other aspects of human existence. A lot of the Romantic movement was not particularly explicitly theist or Christian, but just a sense that there is more, particularly in the experience of nature and of relations, human relations, than simply logic. So in the arts, again, it reflected particularly in the music. Instead of a very sort of rigid kind of approach to music, you had a much more, broader themes and broader use of instruments and motifs in music. So this kind of movement is often looked down upon because it has too much of an emotional base to it. Mm-hmm. So that's why when he's talking about somehow Romanticism is wrong, and sort of accusing some of the in the Russian religious Renaissance of being infected by this. We saw a little bit of this when we were looking at those texts relating to experience of nature. This was a fairly typical theme in Western Romanticism in the early 19th century. So, yes, you had a question.
So is Romanticism the understanding that it's not only rational, there's also the intuitive side,
yes.
Or they thought it's either or it was more of a holistic approach?
I would say it's a more holistic approach, but the emphasis was very much sort of on restoring the balance. And often in intellectual movements, that's what happens. You have something going off in one direction, and then people realize that, well, there's too much emphasis on that, we'll pull in the other direction. So the emphasis more on the intuitive, emotional, personal experience side of human existence. And quite often it's difficult to sort of find the balance between these two. I mean, looking at it in retrospect, we could say, well, human existence has both. You can't have just one or the other, because you can't reduce. This is a form of reduction. You can't reduce human existence. We are, as Aristotle said, rational animals. Now, you can accuse Aristotle and those who follow Aristotle as emphasizing the rational part, but the animal part is still there, the sort of concrete, material existence, human existence. And that's where the intuitive side ultimately and the emotional side comes in. It's a question of keeping the two in equilibrium and balance, and looking at, as you said, a more sort of holistic approach.
Do they take also, like, each of them, can they take a negative existence in of themselves, like whether it's the rational or the intuitive? What I'm trying to say is that, okay, rational is good, to use simple terms, the intuitive side is good, but both of them, if not applied correctly, can degenerate into other things. Or is it a matter of looking at those things as base, and then how can we, it's that meta understanding of those two?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, certainly you can have a degeneration. This is one of the critiques of, particularly of the Enlightenment, because it focused so much on rationality. It sort of drove God away from his own creation. The typical Enlightenment philosophy is known as deism, and deism recognizes existence of God as the creator, but the image is a very 18th century one. The creator who, having created, then sort of walks away and leaves creation to go on its own way. And the image, classic image, is that of the clockmaker, who makes a clock, winds it up, and then walks away. That's not at all a Christian notion.
So God made the world, but he's not in the world, something along those lines?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's only a very short step from that to straight into atheism. Why do we need God? Particularly if we admit that the world always existed, that the creation, it wouldn't be creation, that the universe, the cosmos, is eternal, is itself eternal. We don't need God anymore. The creation has its own internal forces that determine everything that goes on. Very close to, again, use the word determine, very close to a form of determinism. I mean, modern science is based on that principle. That doesn't mean that a scientist cannot be a believer, but he cannot introduce a God into his science, his or her science. Science has to be based on observation and logic, in effect, analysis. Like I said, these are very short steps from one to another, and this is in effect what happened in the 19th century. This kind of very rational approach led directly into philosophy such as Marxism, where it's under the general heading of materialism.
Would capitalism be its opposite side?
Capitalism, of course, I mean, this is an economic theory, an economic practice, but it it's really more, yes, it is. It's a pendant from Enlightenment thinking. And particularly the emphasis in the Enlightenment on the individual and the individual's rights. And I have to see that partly in a political context, because one of the concerns in the Enlightenment, reflected in the American Revolution and the French Revolution, is the establishment of the rights of the people against the rulers. So, in the Declarations of Human Rights, that's one of the underlying principles from the French Revolution and incorporated into the American Constitution. But the context was that the rulers sort of disregarded everybody else in society. So the counterbalance is, well, everyone has rights vis-a-vis those who govern them. And there's a very short step from that emphasis on individual rights into the economic sphere. That those who can accumulate capital, and we're getting into sort of the background to Marxism. Okay, let's see if there's anything else. One of the, I think it's perhaps a characteristic of the Russians as a whole, at least this group. Often they're very extreme in their language. I don't know if you've noticed that in reading some of these texts. Their language is put in terms of sort of a maximalism, sort of putting everything into the same pot. You can just tell by the language. For example, when it says, the sentence I just read there, the substitution of religious philosophy for theology characterized all Western Romanticism. All. Well, let's be a little bit more subtle than that. A little bit further down, towards the end, about 5 lines up, again talking about Berdyaev. Berdyaev was totally in the grip of German mystical visions, as though there was sort of nothing else there. You have to sort of discount that. It's typical of Russian writing, and particularly of Frosky in this book, but also, as we saw sometimes in Berdyaev, he does the same thing. He gets carried away with his language. A lot of this text here from the bottom of the left-hand side on page 141, the last paragraph there. The most characteristic monument of the pre-war period remains Father Pavel Ferensky's famous work, The Pillar and Ground of the Truth, is the way it's usually translated, 1914. And the rest of this, the next few pages in the book, are really a critique of Ferensky. Now, it's easy to know where this came from. Frosky did a review of the book, and the text in here, which he then put into The Ways of Russian Philosophy, is in effect his review of the book. It's personally, I think it's very unfortunate. He doesn't go any further in his analysis of the Russian religious Renaissance and concentrates on poor Ferensky, particularly the book. Some of the points he makes are valid, particularly his critique of Sophia, Divine Wisdom, on page 142 on the left-hand side. And probably the major weakness in Ferensky's thinking in his book is with respect to Christ. Down at the bottom of page 142, reason is safe from doubt through a consciousness of the Holy Trinity, about which Ferensky speaks with great ardor. He presents the speculative meaning of the dogma of the Trinity as the truth of reason, which you can't do entirely, of course. However, he somehow bypasses the incarnation and proceeds immediately from a discussion of the Trinity to the doctrine of the Spirit, the Comforter. His book simply contains no discussion of Christology. The experiment in Orthodox theodicy is somehow carried out without Christ. The image of Christ, the image of the God-man, becomes a vague shadow lost in the background. Is this not the reason why Ferenczi's book contains so little joy? His beauty is merely autumnal, a dying, wearing beauty. He does not rejoice in the coming of the Lord. He is overcome with expectation of the Comforter and with the hope for the Spirit. Some of his expressions there, when he talks about autumnal, dying, weary beauty, are actually romantic. It's the kind of language we find in Romanticism, which he's just criticized. But his point here is correct. There's no chapter on Christology in Ferenczi's book. It's a major weakness, very certainly, and one for which Bulgakov set out to remedy. I think it's this, even though this is published in 1937, this critique was known before then, and Bulgakov realized that he needed to place considerable emphasis on Christ, in effect, as the center of Christianity, very obviously, and not only the Trinity and the Spirit, as Ferenczi does. Bulgakov's book, The Lamb of God, is entirely on Christ. So it's a bit of an answer to this critique. Now, this book, Ferenczi's book was published in 1937, but his review of Ferenczi's book is much earlier than that, and of course, you know, the two of them were together in Paris. So Bulgakov was very well aware of this weakness in Ferenczi's project. So he produced an entire book on Christ called The Lamb of God, published in 1933. I said that the language is of his critique of Ferenczi, personally I think is grossly unfair, because he goes beyond criticizing Ferenczi's ideas, his theology, to criticizing Ferenczi as a person. And again, the Russians easily do this, but I think it's, I said, it's grossly unfair to do that, because you're, you know, under the pretext of writing theology, you're criticizing somebody as a person. And just to show how wrong he is, so he's writing this in 1937. At that time, it wasn't known what happened to Ferenczi. He stayed in Russia. He had been arrested. But after that, he kind of disappeared into the Gulag system. So Ferenczi was a very easy target. Unlike Bulgakov, who's his boss at St. Sergius, Ferenczi couldn't fight back. So it was very easy to take potshots at him. And in some ways, you can almost see Ferenczi as a bit of a stand-in for Bulgakov. But what he writes to me is just exaggerated because of this sort of personal attack, and just to show how, to me, how wrong he is. On page 141, on the right-hand side, at the bottom of the first paragraph, Ferenczi always lived in a secluded, cozy nook, and such aesthetic solitude is where he wished to live. He escaped from the tragic crossroads of life and concealed himself in a confined but comfortable cell. Especially the second sentence there. He escaped from the tragic crossroads of life and concealed himself in a confined but comfortable cell. Well, if you look at the lives of the two of them, it was Florovsky who escaped from the tragic crossroads of life by going into exile. And the tragic crossroads of life, to me at that time, was the communist period, the beginning of the communist period in the 1920s, when Florensky decided to stay in Russia. And Florovsky and his family left. So where were the tragic crossroads of life? They were in Russia. The other part of it, he concealed himself in a confined but comfortable cell. Well, Florensky's cell, as it turned out in the 1930s, was in the Gulag. Where was Florovsky? Well, he was in Paris. And just to be fair, I think if Florovsky had known of Florensky's ultimate fate, Florensky was shot in 1937 by a Soviet firing squad. I don't think he would have been as severe as he is in this text. Okay, it's not to say that some of the critiques that he offers, not only of Florensky but of the Russian religious Renaissance, are not valid. But in this kind of writing, you have to sort of see, well, what's the other side? And the other side are some of the positive things that I've mentioned, and some of which have carried on into neo-patristic theology, of which, of course, Florovsky is the main advocate and kind of an apostle. Any questions on this? The second text, critical text, is Michael Pomazanski's text, beginning on page 131. It's an annex to his book, Orthodox Dogmatic Theology, A Concise Exposition, originally written published in Russian in 1963, and then translated into English by Father Seraphim Rose. He talks about new currents in Russian philosophical theological thought. These new currents, as he talks about, are really a Russian religious philosophy, which had already been around for about 80 years, so it's hardly new. The whole of this text is really a critique of Russian religious philosophy. Somehow, Pomazansky has missed neo-patristic theology, which even by the original edition in 1963 had already become prominent in Orthodox theology. We won't go through this in detail, but you see a series of critiques from a more traditionalist point of view, and particularly from the point of view of academic theology. Pomazansky is very much a product of academic or school theology, reflected in his book, Orthodox Dogmatic Theology, which is one of these sort of manuals of dogmatic theology, trying to bring, as I said, all of the sort of major doctrines of Christianity under one general conceptual framework. So the ideas coming out of Russian religious philosophy just don't fit into that kind of framework, and we're in opposition to it in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So it's not surprising that he's very critical of this kind of approach to theology. There is hidden in this text, and you'll see that begin on page 135 and up to the end. His main target is Soloviev, Vladimir Soloviev. Again, sort of an easy target because some of his ideas are pretty far out, and particularly the sophiology idea of holy wisdom. And section 4, the teaching of the wisdom of God in Holy Scripture, he uses a number of texts, particularly from the New Testament, to try to undermine the biblical basis that the sophiologists used for their doctrine of divine wisdom. There is one paragraph in here, though, where he, I think, correctly expresses the problem of Christian philosophy. It's always been sort of one of the sort of delicate matters with the relationship between philosophy and theology. This is on page 134, down at the bottom. Hilda, do you have that there? Christian religious philosophy. Yeah. Could you?
But Christian religious philosophy has a difficult path to bring together freedom of thought as a principle of philosophy with faithfulness to dogmas and the whole teaching of the Church. Go by the free way, whatever the free mind draws you, says the duty of the thinker. Be faithful to divine truth, whispers to him the duty of the Christian. Therefore, one might always expect that in practical realization, the compilers
there's the word of is missing.
Of the systems of Christian philosophy will be forced to sacrifice, willingly or unwillingly, the principles of one sphere in favor of the other. The Church consciousness welcomes sincere attempts at creating a harmonious, philosophical Christian worldview, but the Church views them as private, personal creations and does not sanction them with its authority. In any case, it is essential there be a precise distinction between dogmatic theology and Christian philosophy, and every attempt to turn dogmatics into Christian philosophy must be decisively rejected.
Okay, see, there's a 2 there, and there's a footnote, and I haven't checked back, but I'm not sure whether the footnote is from Bomazansky or Seraphim Rose.
Mm-hmm. Should I continue reading?
Yeah, just read to the end of that. Because I think the footnote is Seraphim Rose, but I said I didn't check back.
Okay. Probably the most successful attempt from the Orthodox point of view at the creation of a true Christian philosophy in 19th century Russia is to be found in the philosophical essays of I.M. Kiryevsky, a spiritual son of Elder Macarius of Akhtina.
Yes, who also helped, yeah.
What am I missing?
Yeah, there's
One-
one page missing here.
One page missing.
Oh, no. Is 135 not there?
Oh, I'll read this from here. Okay, which one? Where is it? Doesn't
The
start.
top of the top.
Who also helped the elder in Optina translations of the works of the Holy Fathers. Unfortunately, Russian religious thought in the second half of the 19th century did not follow his lead. If it had, Russian Orthodoxy might have been spared the neo-Gnostic speculations of Soloviev and such followers of his as
Bulgakov and Berdiaev.
well,
Whose influence I'll just finish. Whose influence continues in liberal Orthodox circles even to this day. Kiryevsky's philosophy might well be considered the Orthodox answer to the speculations. What he's referring to as liberal Orthodox circles, even to this day, I think would be Father Alexander Schmemann and Father John Meyendorff in particular.
okay.
He's referring to. That's why I think it's Seraphim Rose's, but it could be Pomazansky's. But his expression of the basic dilemma of Christian philosophy there, I think, is very true.
Mm-hmm.
The notion of philosophy being a reflection of human thought and faithfulness to the dogmas coming from revelation, on the other hand, is a very difficult one. But he's expressed the problem very neatly there. Okay. It's ultimately, I think, very difficult to arrive at a balanced assessment of Russian religious philosophy because of sort of extreme views on certain of the personalities and certain of the ideas arising from it. One of the themes of my book is precisely the relationship between Russian religious philosophy and neo-patristic theology, and an attempt to redress the balance, showing the soundness of some of the basis of the Russian religious Renaissance. One of these, it's not an excuse for it, but Swarovski in particular, even though his training was as a historian, he often tends to dehistoricize situations. If you read his critique of Russian religious philosophy, he takes the ideas out of their context and critiques them as ideas. Now, that's legitimate up to a certain point, but only to a certain point. Ideas grow up in a milieu and have to be seen at least partly in the context of that milieu. And this he does not do. And hence you see Berdiaev's critique of Swarovski's book. One of the reasons is because he doesn't do this, which is very strange for a historian not to be aware of the historical context in which ideas arise. The main point here is that the leaders of the Russian religious Renaissance presented a Christian alternative in a context of social and cultural and intellectual ferment, which was largely non-Christian. So they stood up and said, well, wait a minute now, there's another way of looking at society and looking at the future of Russia, which maintains this continuity with Russia's Christian base, but is not that of the official Russian Orthodox Church. And I think this is one of the key aspects for looking at this movement, is looking at it in that context. Then you can say, well, yes, that's very true and it's very valuable, even if some of its ideas were pretty far out. So it's a question of sort of a balance there. But if you focus only on ideas, you forget about their importance in their context, in their time.
What's the current, I don't know if I asked this question before, what's the current situation in Russia, in the Russian church, and where are they in terms of that balance, or they just threw the whole thing out and they have to?
Well, I say we talked a little bit about the way most of the leaders in the early 1920s went into exile, either voluntarily or they were forced out by Lenin, and tried to maintain this kind of approach in exile, but ultimately it didn't work because they were no longer in the natural milieu in which it grew up. And so the approach disappeared after World War II, pretty much. Now, within Russia itself, during the communist period, virtually none of the works were available. A lot of them had been produced in the West, but even those beforehand, most of them simply became unavailable because they Marxism, Leninism, communist philosophy. So there was kind of a break within Russia itself during the communist period of these thinkers, including both the pre-revolutionary and the post-revolutionary group. With the fall of communism, almost all of the works, all of the writings were reprinted in Russia. But the thinking of this group, in a sense, met up with the same problems in the revived Russian Orthodox Church as at the beginning of the 20th century. The ideas were just too far out, too unfamiliar to be largely acceptable. There are a few exceptions, but again, the main exception, Father Alexander Men, himself was sort of on the margins of the Russian Orthodox Church, and I don't know if you know his story. He came into prominence in the last years of the communist period, and in fact in the last 2 or 3 years of the communist period. He was the most visible Orthodox and Christian voice, personality on the Russian scene. He was killed, he was assassinated in 1990, because we don't know who actually killed him, but he may have been the last victim of the KGB. That's the most commonly accepted theory of who actually killed him. But he was very much attuned and familiar with the thinking of the Russian religious Renaissance, and incorporated a lot of it into his own thinking. But as I said, he has pretty much been marginalized by the Russian Orthodox Church. Again, sort of much too liberal, open in his ideas. You know, is there a revival of some sort of the thinking of the Russian religious Renaissance? Partly. There certainly is a revival of interest in Sergius Bulgakov. Bulgakov's theological output is enormous. Of course, he wrote almost entirely only in Russian, and even those works that were published in English of his in the 1930s were translations done by others. There were a couple of books published in the 1930s intended for a non-Orthodox audience. One of them is the Orthodox Church. It's a small book intended as a kind of a general introduction to the Orthodox Church, originally published in English, even though it was written in Russian, in English and in French, and then only later published in Russian. The other one is a small book on sophiology, on Divine Sophia. Again, to try to explain his ideas on sophiology to a non-Russian, non-Orthodox audience. What has happened in the last 15 years is that most of Bulgakov's major publications, major books, have now been published in English translation. So there is a kind of a Bulgakovian revival going on, because his thinking is so profound and covers a wide range of subjects with a lot of sort of original ideas and notions. But my assessment of this is that, first of all, it is largely in non-Orthodox academic circles. And one would be hard-pressed to find Orthodox theologians who are Bulgakovians in that kind of narrow sense. The only one that I name all the time is a French theologian, a French Orthodox theologian called Antoine Arjikovsky. I would say he's probably the only real Bulgakovian Orthodox theologian. He has done a major study, which is translated and published in English, on the exile group of the Russian Orthodox Renaissance in Paris in the 20s and 30s. It's really a study of the journal, Put. You see, when Berdyaev was writing for the 10th anniversary, it's that same journal. So Arjikovsky has done quite a detailed study of, if you like, the thinking of those who contributed to the book, to the journal over, the journal was published between 1925 and its last issue, the last number in the journal was 1940, so over a period of about 15 years. How this reflected the ideals and the thinking of this group. He's also written a little book only on that. That study is in English. He's also written a book specifically on Bulgakov, which is not translated into English. But he's the only one that I would say is a real Bulgakovian. Others are interested in Bulgakov's ideas, sometimes to criticize them, sometimes to try to relate them to other Orthodox thinkers, but I wouldn't describe them as sort of going along with Bulgakov's ideas. Yes, yeah. But I don't think we've heard the last of Bulgakov. But I said I'm not certain just how far it's going to sort of gain, his thinking is going to gain widespread acceptance. Maybe little portions of it here and there that are relevant in certain areas. For example, some of his social thinking, political and social thinking. But the main theme that infuses all of his theology is sophiology, is divine wisdom, and that is the real problematic thing. In some cases, you can say, well, it's kind of irrelevant to some of his other ideas, but sometimes it's very hard to extract those other ideas the way they're kind of enmeshed in the sophiology.
Is it because they consistently, kind of indirectly or directly target, the councils, the Trinity, the councils and the Trinity and the establishment of certain dogmas within the church? Or maybe it looks at it in a different way?
Well, I mean, what sophiology tries to do is it's really an attempt to explain how God relates to the world.
Right. I mean, we have that understanding.
Yeah, it's not undermining particular dogmas, although some people say it does.
Mm-hmm.
See, initially, I don't know, is it you were doing the sophiology?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so now I thought it was, that's why you're interested in the subject. Well, initially Bulgakov went along with Soloviev and Florensky in seeing divine wisdom personified as a kind of a personified intermediary between a God as Trinity and creation. Well, I think I may have said this line. He realized that this didn't work. Yes, he and the others were accused of creating a fourth hypostasis in the Trinity. So then he tried to attach the notion to the essence side, a little bit more successfully, but also more obscurely. Mm-hmm. And this was the background to the whole of the Sophia controversy in the mid-1930s, mm-hmm. about which I'm sure you'll speak. So this is the real stumbling block. which I think detracts attention from his thinking and that of Soloviev and Florensky in other areas, is the sociology.
Is it because of its non-acceptance within the Orthodox context, or more? Yeah, is it because of?
Well, not only Orthodox, but I think
It goes against, I guess, the other.
yeah, outside Orthodoxy as well.
Yeah.
When the conflict blew up in the mid-1930s, Bulgakov had been very active in the Orthodox Anglican dialogue through the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. And the Anglicans didn't know what to make of this either,
Right.
which is one of the reasons why he wrote his book, Holy Wisdom, Holy Sophia, in the 1930s, to try to explain a little bit more what it's all about. But they never really caught on. They couldn't deal with it any more than a lot of the other Orthodox, particularly the younger Orthodox, who were heading off in another direction, in a sort of more patristically grounded direction.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to our next subject. What is generally referred to as neo-patristic theology. I've already gone on a little bit about sort of the background to the origins of neo-patristic theology. The origins go back to the 1930s, in particular to three important Orthodox theologians. One of them I've kept naming this evening, George Florovsky. And his name will come up a lot because he is really the one who established as a theological program, very explicitly, it was referred to as a return to the fathers in Orthodox thinking. And we'll sort of go through his what he thought was the basis of this program and how he developed it himself. The other leading figure of the time and subsequently up until the mid-1950s was Vladimir Lossky. The third, although not really related to the other two, see these two, Florovsky and Lossky, are of course both Russians. They were both in Paris during this period. Florovsky until 1949, when he moved to New York to become dean of the St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary. The third one is a Romanian, Father Dumitru Stăniloae. He was very much in the same mode of theology early on in the 1930s. So, Dumitru Stăniloae. L-A-O-A-E. Stăniloae. I'm not sure I got it right. I think so. But he never had as much influence as the others because he wrote only in Romanian. It was a very practical problem, and his works until fairly late were not translated into Western European languages. So sort of keep that in mind when we talk about his role as a sort of one of the founders of neo-patristic theology. Florovsky said is really the main figure. His academic background was in philosophy and history prior to the Russian Revolution. And in 1920, his family was forced to leave Russia. He made his way first to Prague in Czechoslovakia, which was one of the major centers for the Russian exiles. for a few years, not for very long, because of economic problems in Czechoslovakia. But in 1925, most of the leading intellectual figures found their way to Paris, especially with the establishment of the St. Sergius Institute of Orthodox Theology. Even though Frosky did not have an academic degree in theology, he was invited at the suggestion of none other than Father Sergius Bulgakov to come to St. Sergius Academy to teach patristics. He had no background in patristics. But he plunged himself into the study of the Fathers of the Church and became the leading, explicit advocate for revival of patristic theology in Orthodoxy. So he was at St. Vladimir's, St. Sergius from 1925 until the beginning of World War II. When the war broke out, he was outside of France and did not return to France. Instead, he made his way to Yugoslavia and spent the war years in Yugoslavia, and came back to Paris around 1946 or 45, 46, just after the end of the war. But his position was very uncomfortable. First of all, his job had been given to somebody else. And because of his critique in this book, The Ways of Russian Theology, published in 1937, he was not particularly well received when he returned to St. Sergius Institute, even though Sergius Bulgakov had died in 1944. Frosky was invited to go to New York to the St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, which he did. He was not there for very long. He was not an easy personality, Frosky, and certainly was not an administrator. So eventually, well, very quickly, and relatively quickly, after 5 or 6 years, he was invited to leave. Frosky was very well known in ecumenical circles and had a lot of friends, particularly in Protestant churches, and they took care of him. First with an appointment at the Harvard School of Theology, which is not a bad appointment at all. He also taught at the Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, so that was in Boston. And towards the end of his life, he moved to Princeton University. The Princeton School of Theology is a leading Presbyterian center. It's one of the leading theological schools in the United States. There's kind of a bit of a joke that Frosky is the only person who was unable to hold down a job and was eventually sort of asked or voluntarily left from the 3 leading Orthodox schools of theology in Western Europe and North America, St. Sergius Institute in Paris, St. Vladimir's in New York, and Holy Cross too. He ran into trouble there as well. It was actually in Boston, when he was still in Harvard, that he had his most well-known student, none other than Metropolitan John Zizioulas. Zizioulas and Kallistos Ware are kind of the sort of leading elder statesmen of Orthodox theology today. So, from the mid-1930s until about 1970, Frosky was also very active in the ecumenical movement as an Orthodox representative, and had a great deal of influence in that. He's one of the founders of the World Council of Churches. we'll look at, if you take the course on, I'm giving advertising, take the course next spring on ecclesiology, ecumenism, and religious diversity. We'll look at sort of Filosofsky's thinking and activities in the ecumenical sphere. Filosofsky saw a return to the fathers to sort of simplify the thinking and expression as an alternative both to academic theology that we saw earlier, seen as being detached from the life of the church and strongly influenced by Western scholasticism on the one hand, this hand, the right hand. On the other hand, the left hand, the excessive speculations of religious philosophy, which were indebted to Western philosophies, not scholasticism, but especially German idealism, and venturing in some areas too far from the doctrines of the church. Filosofsky first articulated his theological vision at the Congress of Orthodox Theologians, held in Athens in late November, early December 1936. This brought together representatives of the then leading theological schools, of which there weren't a lot. There were only about half a dozen. It was the first time that they had got together and sort of discussed amongst themselves as representatives of Orthodox theological schools. Filosofsky presented two papers. The first is Western Influences in Russian Theology, delivered in German actually. And the second paper was Patristics of Modern Theology, very short, it's only 4 pages long. And these kind of set out a framework for his thinking and his development of what later became known as the neo-patristic synthesis or neo-patristic theology. I did hand out earlier a paper. Did everyone get a copy of that from? I still have copies of it. I did. I had several copies of it. Where did they go? Here they are. Yes.
Thank you.
Did you? Oh. That's the wrong paper. This is my original. I had more copies. This is Hannah's. Oh, there it is. Okay. How many of you have looked at this text, Western Influences in Russian Theology? Nobody? Okay. Let's take the time to read the text here by Maged Mikhail, who's one of our online students. So I think he really does capture the core of this. It's longer than I thought. Well, let's have a look. I'll just sort of pick up highlights from the main paragraph. So, in what he calls chapter 1 is really section 1 of an essay. Filosofsky traces Western influences back to the 14th and 15th centuries of the city of Novgorod, and then he mentions some of these Western influences from the early period. In chapter 2, Filosofsky turns to the other side of the Russian border, Lithuania and Poland, where direct encounters with the Reformation and the Jesuit order took place. Some of these things we've seen a little bit further on, the confession of Cyril Lucaris and that of Peter Mogilevich. Okay, are they leaving? The Metropolitan Kiev, who expressed his crypto-romanticism in his Orthodox confession in his book of Ritual Theology. Foster goes on to clarify the devastating influence of the theological schools and seminaries established by Peter the Great. Well, they weren't established by Peter the Great, sorry, that's a little bit of an error there. They were actually established by Peter Mogila, not Peter the Great, which were thoroughly Latin schools where the text of, so the first one was established by Peter Mogila, and then so that was the one in Kiev, and then there were subsequent ones established in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kazan. Thoroughly Latin schools where the text of scripture, grammar, rhetoric, and poetics were quoted and taught in Latin, and Russian rhetoric was taught only at higher levels. All of which caused, according to Frosty, a split between theological learning and experience of the church. One still prayed in Slavonic but taught in Latin. Chapter 3 explains, Flosky explains how the Latin orientation of the Russian theological schools was replaced by that of the Reformation. Well, this is a later period, particularly through the writings of Theophan Prokopovich, collaborator of Peter the Great. And in the last paragraph, he talks about Pietism, which arose in addition to the influence of Protestant scholasticism in the second half of the 18th century at the expense of church doctrines, traditions, and sacraments, which were all undeveloped. This Pietism will come back, we'll see it again in 20th century Greece. So on the second page, Frosky, returning to the original sources of Eastern Orthodoxy is the only way to defeat the inclination of Protestantism, by the creative restoration of the Church Fathers' writings, not by the scholastic assessments of ready-made solutions of Western thought. Within this context, Frosky rejects the dogmatics written by Makarios Bulgakov, Metropolitan Moscow. We talked about this text before. Then he goes on, chapter 6, or section 6, investigates the influence of German idealistic philosophy on the Russian theological schools, whose professors lean towards the philosophical interpretation of the data of Revelation. We talked a little bit about this, the influence of German idealism. Frosky emphasizes that the influence of philosophy, this is idealist philosophy, is conscious in the systematic construction of Russian theologians such as the Slavophiles. Well, Khomikov was the leader of the Slavophiles, and Vladimir Soloviev. Chapters 6, 5, and 6, Frosky concludes that the Western influences in Russian theology led to the split in Orthodox consciousness, a split between piety and theology, between theological erudition and spirituality, between theological schools and church life. So we saw echoes of this in Frosky's critique of the Russian religious philosophy, these sort of splits between the different aspects or approaches to philosophy and spirituality in Russia in the late imperial period. So I'll just read the last paragraph. In this paper, I find Father Florowski's analysis, implemented historical context examination of the Western influences on the Orthodox Church strong and coherent. Nonetheless, I am struggling to accept one inconsistency that I could not help but capture between Florowski's utter rejection of all Western all Western elements with emphasis on the conflict and split due to dangerous borrowing from heterodox Western sources, and eventually his ultimate call to the return of the Fathers as the only way for the Orthodox Church to regain independence from Western captivity, and between his long contribution to ecumenism movement, as noted by, guess who, in his account review essay, George Florowski's Theological Vision. So the point that is bothering my head is how to reconcile a fairly consistent, strong critique of Western influence, not only in Russian Orthodox thought, which is the focus of this essay of Florowski's, but in effect by implication across Orthodoxy in general, and his contribution to and his participation in the ecumenical movement. They seem to be going in different directions, and yet there's no inconsistency. One has to understand the full scope of Florovsky's thinking and the basis, as he sees it, for Orthodox involvement in ecumenism. And there they come together. You can see that he is totally consistent. Unlike other Orthodox theologians, from about the mid-1930s onwards, Florovsky was pretty consistent in his theology. Somebody like Bulgakov went through a series of evolutions over time. Florovsky did to some extent, but as I said, by about 1933, he maintained a pretty steady line throughout. Certainly, Florovsky's involvement in the ecumenical movement, which we'll see again in the course next spring, he got into a squabble with, guess who? Father Sergius Bulgakov on ecumenism. I'll just summarize this very quickly because it sort of resolves the apparent dilemma here. Both were deeply committed to Orthodox involvement in the ecumenical movement, such as it existed in the pre-war period, pre-World War II. So this is before the foundation of the World Council of Churches, which is in 1948, but for different reasons. Bulgakov's vision, which is entirely consistent with the spirit of the Russian religious Renaissance, saw the church, the Christian church, as having a certain basis in common and a certain common existence, despite its apparent division into different visible institutions. So he and those who supported this vision emphasized what unites Christians. Obviously Christ, Scripture, a certain liturgical tradition, although many of the Protestant denominations had sort of wandered away from that liturgical tradition. But the Protestants that he was dealing with, not the Protestants, the non-Orthodox that Bulgakov was primarily dealing with, the Anglicans, and particularly the High Church Anglicans. So the question of church unity was a search for what are these common elements. And it was on this basis that Bulgakov put forward a proposal for a partial intercommunion with the Anglicans involved between the Orthodox and the Anglicans involved in the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. And this was the subject of their dispute, was this what is known as the intercommunion proposal. Florovsky's view was that what separates Christians must be resolved before there can be a restoration of communion. And these, so putting the emphasis said on what separates, which are by and large dogmatic or theological issues. So Orthodox involvement for Sergius Bulgakov in the ecumenical movement said it is this search for unity and the expression of what unites. For Florovsky, it was highlighting the differences, the sort of problems at a theological level, but the importance of Orthodox involvement is to witness to the truth of the Orthodox Church, to show, and there's a little bit of triumphalism in this, to show to others where the Orthodox are coming from as reflecting the fullness of the Christian truth. Even though in terms of actually influencing others may be fairly small. So he was not as sanguine as Bulgakov and those who followed Bulgakov about the possibilities of meaningful Christian unity because of the emphasis on what separates in terms of dogma. But I said both were equally committed, but for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what brings together Swarovski, and I think resolves the dilemma here. Yes, there's a critique of Western sources, but also an openness to engage in dialogue as a form of witness to the fullness of the Christian tradition as found in Orthodoxy. That's what brings the two together. Okay, so to get back to Swarovski's paper on Western influences in Russian theology, let's have a look at this, and hopefully we'll have time to look at the other paper as well. It starts on page 153. What this essay is, you can see here the sort of the historical context. So it's a paper that Swarovski delivered at this council of this Congress of Orthodox Theologians in late 1936 in Athens. You recall that his book, The Ways of Orthodox Theology, was published in 1937, the following year. So what this is, in effect, is a summary of his book, the major themes. And what he's trying to do here is, as the introduction from Maged points out, is to look at all of the different ways in which Russian religious and theological thinking has been influenced by the West at different periods from different sources, all the way from some of the medieval through the Latin side and the Protestant side and Pietism up to German philosophy in the Russian religious Renaissance. So the different sections are kind of different historical periods. When one reads both this article and portions of the book, which is a kind of an expanded version of it, there are very few heroes, very few good guys, because it seems like everyone's been influenced by the West, and this Western influence per se is always taken to be negative. Now, this ultimately proves to be one of the weaknesses of Swarovski's theological project, but also of neo-patristic theology as a whole. And we'll come to that more in the next class when we look at some of the critiques of neo-patristic theology. One of the heroes is the leading ecclesial figure in the Russian Orthodox Church in the 19th century, Metropolitan Filaret. On page 160, for example, on the right-hand side, about 10 lines down, with a Filaret. So this is Metropolitan Filaret of Moscow, who was the leading figure in the Russian Orthodox Church for close to 50 years. begins the real liberation of Russian theology not only from Western influences but from Westernization in general. It occurred in the only way which could have achieved lasting results, that is, by a creative return to patristic foundations and sources, by return to the fathers of the Church. This was the true source of inspiration of Philaret and served as the criterion of his own presentation. I said Philaret emerges as a hero because of this, but even Philaret, when we look at his major theological work, his catechism, one finds a lot of Western influence. First of all, the whole structure of the catechism is Western. A typical catechism structure is question and answer, which is derived from medieval scholasticism. But also some of the ways he expresses things and the very structure of the catechism, how he deals with different subjects, is very much in the mode of a textbook of dogmatic theology. So I would say, yes, begins the liberation, but it's only a very modest beginning with Philaret. Let's go towards the end of this text, where he starts to pull out sort of his solution to the problem. This is on page 164 on the left-hand side. Who has that? Do you have it?
Yes.
Western influences in Russian theology? Okay, do you want to read that paragraph then?
Sure. Western influences in Russian theology must be overcome.
Now, you notice this is in italics,
Yeah.
so it's emphasis.
Must.
Must be overcome.
Must be. This concerns, first of all, the inorganic Western style. This process actually began long ago in the Russian schools, precisely at the time of Philaret, and in connection with the revival of asceticism in Russian monasteries. It is sufficient to recall the school of Starets, Paisi,
Velichkovsky.
thank you, and especially the hermitage of Optino. Orthodox theology can ultimately restore the independence from Western influences only through a spiritual return to patristic sources and foundations. To return to the Fathers does not mean to retreat from the present or from history. It is not a retreat from the modernity or from the field of battle. It means much more. It is not only a preservation and protection of patristic experience, but also the very discovery of this experience and the beginning of this experience into life. On the other hand, independence from the West must not degenerate into an alienation which becomes simply opposed to the West. For a complete break with the West does not give a true and authentic liberation. Presently, Orthodoxy can and must no longer circumvent or hush up the issue. This, however, means that Orthodoxy must encounter the West creatively and spiritually. The dependence and imitation of the past cannot be considered an encounter. An encounter only really occurs in the freedom and equality of love. It is not sufficient merely to repeat Western answers, or to play one Western answer off against another, but rather we must precisely recognize, experience, and penetrate these Western questions. We must familiarize ourselves with the entire dramatic problematic of Western religious thought.
So, comments or questions? He's sort of edging towards his program here, but not laying it out completely.
Well, I think he actually develops that we have to actually start this, what is called, spiritual, kind of like spiritual development, like ascetic spiritual development, and through this development we have to like counter Western thought.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what he's saying, like monastic development, and monastic development will return back to our fathers in terms of like patristic theology, and that's how he's planning to counter the Orthodox. But he also says that we should not break off from West totally and just say this doesn't mean that we have to break off from them, but it says in certain points when Orthodox, what we are talking about Orthodox patristic theology, like fathers theology, it has to be developed through spiritual or monastic line.
Mm-hmm. When he talks about the revival asceticism in Russian monasteries and starts by Velichkovsky, what is he referring to without naming? This comes from actually the course on modern spirituality.
It's Dostoevsky's, no?
No. What he's referring to really is the publication of the Philokalia, first in Greek in 1782, and then subsequently, and this is where Velichkovsky comes into play, in Slavonic in the early 19th century. Actually, the first Slavonic edition is 1793, as I recall, of the Philokalia. And then there was a full edition in the early 19th century, and there was a Russian edition later on, because, of course, Slavonic is the church language. It's not the spoken or written language of the time. So what he refers to it as asceticism here. It really is a spiritual revival that took place based in the Russian monasteries that were subject to the influence from the publication of the Philokalia and its Slavonic and Russian versions. There were allusions to this in Berdyaev's text as well. Now the reason why he's raising it here is the publication of the Philokalia had a great impact in Russian spiritual life, but it can be seen as the beginning of a broad patristic revival. It was not a revival so much on the theological side as on the ascetic or spiritual side, because the authors included in the Philokalia, by and large, and even some of the more theological figures there, the texts in the book are more directed towards the spiritual life. So the impact on broader theology only really started to be felt much later. There was reference to Kireevsky. Kireevsky was kind of a bridge between the two. In the text we have in our book here on New Principles in Philosophy, he calls for a return to the fathers, but it was kind of Florovsky before Florovsky, without elaborating much further. The leaders of the Russian religious Renaissance, at least some of them, particularly Florensky and Bulgakov, were quite conversant with the early fathers of the church, but they felt it was necessary to use other sources of inspiration to deal with the then contemporary problems that they had to face. But as we saw in Florovsky's critique, this was inadequate because it strayed too far from patristic thinking. So that's sort of one important reference there. The hesychastic revival is sometimes referred to, the philocalic revival. It's a spiritual return to patristic sources and foundations, but not one that was particularly directed towards the main theological writings of the early fathers, or the Cappadocians, or St. John Chrysostom, even John of Damascus, Maximus, or Palamas. The other important point that he makes here is in terms of the West. And can someone try to express the sort of two prongs there of his thinking about the West, which we discussed a little bit earlier in connection with the sort of thinking about the West.
He doesn't want to alienate the West. He doesn't want to push them away so they can just ignore Orthodoxy.
Okay, that's one side of it.
But he also doesn't want to ignore the issues with the Protestant thinking.
With the?
With Protestant ideology, and to try to show them where they have strayed from Orthodoxy.
Yes.
It seems to me like when he talks about this is not an encounter that's based on, being balance of power, it's like he's looking at a liberation, to quote his words, by still being able to have an encounter with the West, but when the East or Russia is stronger in its theology or other areas. So he's looking for a more balanced approach to his.
Yeah. See, on the one hand, sorry.
Well, I think he's saying that actually this academic or manual theology, we have to be away from. We have to sort of like start away from this understanding of like a German ideology. We have to go to patristics. But he also says that this manual or academic theology has something, maybe an idea.
Well, he talks about Western influence of Russian theology, the title of his paper, and in some ways close to the title, but certainly is the main theme of his book. These influences that he finds just about everywhere are negative in that they undermine, directly or indirectly, true Orthodox thinking. So that's the negative side. But what he's saying in those last sentences there, on the other hand, independence from the West must not degenerate into an alienation which becomes simply opposed to the West. What he's saying is that this should not lead to a systematic anti-Westernism and a sort of a total rejection of the West. Rather, it should lead to a true dialogue, or what he calls encounter, on the basis of what he says freedom and equality. The previous phases of Western influence were not a true dialogue or encounter. It was kind of an invasion. So he's saying we must encounter from our own base, our own foundation, and which he identifies with the patristic sources and foundations. Then we can enter in, he doesn't use the word dialogue, but that's really what he's talking about. Then we can enter into a meaningful dialogue or encounter from the West, rather than simply submitting to a kind of an invasion. He goes on in the last paragraph there to sort of reiterate the point. Orthodox theology's path of overcoming the Western scandal, the Western influence, does not lie in rejecting or even overthrowing Western results, sort of repeating himself a little bit. The path rather lies in overcoming and surmounting them in a new creative activity. Only a creative return to the unique and ancient depths will serve Orthodox thought as the authentic antidote against the open and hidden or even yet unknown aspects of Western poisoning. Oh boy, he's really laying it on there, isn't he? Orthodox theology is summoned to answer Western questions from the depths of an unbroken Orthodox experience and to confront the movements of Western thought with the unchanging truth of patristic orthodoxy. So he's kind of leaving us dangling there. Is he prepared to go further? Well, he does go further. In the short paper called Patristics in Modern Theology, which follows right on, begin on page 166. You have some footnotes there which are not, the footnotes are basically from the editors, that's Brennan Gallagher and myself, of this edition of a number of Frosky's most important writings. This short paper is a kind of neo-patristic manifesto. Let's use the expression from the Communist Manifesto of 1848. He's laying out a program, a theological program. There are hints of it in the ways of Russian theology, but it's sort of more directly laid out here, what he's calling for. I'm afraid we're running out of time here. So I would certainly ask you to read this very carefully, and we'll start with a discussion of this.
So what page?
Pardon?
Which page?
Well, just a short paper on Patristics in Modern Theology, 166 to 168, but also read the following text, starting on page 169. You see, it's also an extract from the Ways of Russian Theology. It's labeled Chapter 9, Breaks and Links. It's actually the conclusion. It's the concluding chapter to Ways of Russian Theology. And here he lays out in more detail what his theological program is. And I would ask you to read as well the next two texts, Berdiadev's text called Orthodoxia and Humanness. And you see this is on page 182, a review of Archpriest George Forosky, The Ways of Russian Theology. This is what I said is a very emotional critique of Forosky's book. So you have to sort of discard the emotional context, the emotional language that he sometimes uses, and look at the real points that he is criticizing in Forosky. And the final one is another text of George Forosky, The Legacy and Task of Orthodox Theology, in 1948, delivered in New York. And you'll see there in the little heading, it was the first formal occasion at which Forosky used the catchphrase neo-patristic synthesis. And that sort of became the buzzword for his theological program. And personally, I prefer to use the expression neo-patristic theology. It's funny that he would use the word synthesis because of the association of the notion of synthesis in Hegelian philosophy and also in Marxism. So he himself was not entirely abstracted from being influenced by language and notions from German idealism. Okay, I said we'll go on the next class with neo-patristic theology. Now, this is our last class in this segment of the course. I don't have my calendar here, but as I recall, the next class is actually November 1st.
Correct.
It's a Friday. Between now and then, you have things to do. I've been urging you to sort of move along with preparing your proposal for your presentation and research essay, and I think that's moving along well. When you submit, and if you want to ask me further questions about your project before you write it up formally in the proposal, please do so by email, and I'll try to reply very quickly. I'm going home tomorrow, but Thursday I would be available to reply to those. Then Friday, Saturday, and Sunday I'm involved in a meeting, so I won't be available then, but then all of next week. So when you send me your final proposal, I will send it back to you with my comments. And from then on, you should sort of be ready to go. If you're feeling uncertain about, for example, where to start in terms of bibliography, or if I think your bibliography is not sufficient, I will suggest other bibliographic sources to get you started. You will have to go to the library or to find other means of getting some of the material. If you have this, at the end there is a bibliography for some of the themes that are the subjects of the papers. Not all of them, but most of them are there. So there are sort of bibliographical references there, because here it's divided out by chapter. It's not sort of all lumped together. But as I said, I will fill out anything that appears to be lacking. And at any time in the research during the next month, if you get stuck, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. If it's necessary, we can set up either a telephone conversation or even a Skype or a Zoom session. I don't know if you're familiar with Zoom. You are?
I use it for work.
Pardon?
I use it for work.
Use it for work. Okay. It's like Skype, but it's a little bit more stable and versatile than Skype. So it's possible to set up a teleconference from it. It's fairly easy to use. Either the free version or the school has a commercial version which has additional features in it. Now the other thing that you should be doing is the book review, the Losky's Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. And I think you all have in the syllabus the sort of framework for preparing that review in the form of the 8 questions, which you can use as kind of headings, either formally or informally, for the review. So it's kind of like sort of a take-home exam based on the one book. I'll just sort of reiterate a little bit the importance of the book. It is, in effect, the prime example of what we're just getting into, neo-patristic theology. And certainly I consider it, and others consider that book to be the most influential single book of Orthodox theology of the 20th century. So that's why its importance and why I select it as the book for review. To answer the 8 questions, you have to read the book fairly closely and in effect take notes as you go along as to sort of, what pages you'll want to refer to in answering the specific questions. So, any further questions before the break up?
The oral, you mentioned prepare their oral presentation on the research topic as well by.
Sorry? The
Yeah, presentation, yeah.
Present the oral presentation.
the oral presentations will be at the end of the course
Okay.
in the last 3 classes. Now that I think I have most, there may be one missing, that I have most of the subjects, I will prepare a timetable.
Okay.
Oral presentation is for the essay, it's just what, that we were talking about, right?
Yes, yeah.
So that presentation is not until the end of the course.
The last 3 classes. We'll try to do, because there are 9 credit students altogether, we'll try to do 3 in each of the last 3 classes.
Oh, the other, the second part, like 2 presentations, that, no, I think she meant something else, right?
No, because I'm reading in your section here.
Yes.
No classes September 24th to October 31st. Students should complete the book review with Lasky,
Yeah.
the mystical theology due October 31st, and prepare their oral presentations.
Yeah, prepare but not finalize.
Okay,
Because-
seminar on
yeah,
the
sorry,
research topic.
that language is a little bit unclear
Okay.
there. You can work on it, in other words.
Okay.
Work on doing the research and sort of start the writing, so that, by the time we reach early November, because, again, because it's 2 classes a week, we'll very
We'll
quickly
move.
reach the presentation time. But the presentations themselves are the last 3 classes.
Okay.
I think, did I specify there? I think I did, but just to reiterate, so the research essay proposal, which is due sort of like now, the presentation and the essay it's all the same exercise. For the in-class presentation, I'll start this out when I send out the proposed timetable, just to be very clear. There's a limit of 20 minutes speaking. And the rule of thumb that I use is approximately 100 words per minute. So your oral text should be no more than 2,000 words. The written text will be longer. And of course we'll have proper footnotes and references and bibliography and that sort of thing. So the oral presentation is a kind of a bit of a condensation. It's also, you should also think of it as not being the final product, even a condensation of the final product. One of the things, one of the advantages of the oral presentation is that there will be an opportunity for discussion and questions. So you'll get a bit of feedback, not only from me, but from other students. Now, unfortunately, I'm not able to do a completely live session with everybody involved in this course, but what I hope to do, at least for the people who online who will be presenting, to enable them to do a live presentation. I hope. I may need some technical assistance to handle the logistics of that, because I don't feel confident enough to be able to deal with the logistics of a live link and sort of do the teaching at the same time. But I hope to be able to set that up. So I said, not consider it as a final product, but as work in progress, and then take into account comments that will be made for then the final sort of processing of your paper. The paper is due December 15th, so there's another 3 or 4 weeks to finalize the paper. So
in the research proposal, which we have to do now, like next 2 weeks, you just it's sort of like a presentation, like a proposal, like bibliography, which bibliography we're going to use, which subject, and the way we're going to approach the subject, the way we develop the subject.
Yeah, you follow the format there in Annex 2 in the syllabus.
Okay.
Now, some of the things in that format you may not be able to answer completely, or as your research goes along, you may want to change some things.
Yes.
Even the title, you may want to adapt the title. This is normal in a research process because you'll discover things as you go along, but you have to have a clear starting point, and that's the point of that proposal. I think some of you have seen that before. But it really helps to know where you're going. But I said you have to see it as a dynamic process, and you adjust as you go along. In some cases it can be add material, it can be to restructure your paper, it can be to take off material if there's too much, if you're getting into too broad a field.
Yeah.
But I hope that with the discussions that I've had with you so far, and the feedback that I'll give you on the actual written proposal, the subject will be defined in such a way that it is feasible in terms of an essay in a course rather than, you know, a thesis. Or it's so vague that you know, it just, you won't know where you're going at all. I hope it'll be pinned down sufficiently that
So it's not to cover a whole thing, just kind of pick.
it'll be manageable
Okay.
within the requirements for an essay for this course.
How many pages is the paper?
Well, I steer away from defining pages.
I noticed, okay.
I use it in terms of words.
Okay.
So stick with the word count. You know, in Word and the software, you always have the word count.
Yes.
Because the number of pages, it depends on how many pages you put on a word, whether you use single spacing or double spacing. You know, you can put up to 600 words on a page.
Yeah.
So the review
So-
itself should be, the actual paper should be, not the presentation. The paper itself should be how many words?
What does it say there?
The review should be a minimum of
That's the
70.
review,
That's the review.
yes.
And
Further down there, it talks about,
And the maximum of 2,000 words. The review is done on October 31st. And maybe, and further down,
it talks about the essay.
I think it was 3,000 to 3,500.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's 3,000 to
that's it.
3,500.
the final written essay should be a minimum of 3,000 words and a maximum of 3,500. Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
so that would exclude the bibliography.
Yes.
Anyway, if you have any further questions, but I will get back to you quickly to clarify your subjects and the initial bibliography to work with. Again, I said if you're stuck in finding things, I can offer you some tips. But one of the most useful ones is to use the function in the library catalog of the University of Toronto. In the catalog you have a sort of a find function, whether it's books or articles especially. If the articles are not there, there's a way of getting articles. I have some of my own, some of them. Not all of them are digitized, some of them are in print. But I said I can help you if you get stuck for some things, and if things become too difficult, we'll just have to leave them out, that's all. Okay? Good. Well, I'll see you
November.
in
November.
in November,
Yeah.
November 1st.
Thank you.
Thank you.